Nobody wanted this armored heavy starship. I bought it. For 15 credits at a galactic auction. The auctioneer was sweating through his collar when he dropped the opening bid to 15 credits. I was sitting in the back row of Veth9's surplus hall, with a cold cup of something that tasted like rust, watching 600 alien buyers look at each other and decide, collectively, that they would rather leave the galaxy than raise a hand. The thing they were all refusing to touch was a human warship. My warship, as of 30 seconds later, when I held up 3 fingers because that was the hand signal I had seen a Drellin merchant use earlier, and I figured it meant yes. My name is Dax Marrow. I am 31 years old, human, and at the exact moment I became the legal owner of a condemned, biohazard-flagged, 200-year-old armored heavy cruiser, I had 42 credits to my name, a salvage license that was about to expire, and a small ship that leaked recycled air through a crack near the rear coupling that I had been meaning to fix for 8 months. I had not planned on buying anything that day. I had walked into the Veth9 surplus hall because the entrance was free and the hall was warm, and I had been cold for 3 days because my ship's heating unit was the next thing on the list after the air leak. I sat down in the back. I watched a Keth merchant buy a decommissioned fuel processor. I watched a Vorath trade fleet representative buy 12 crates of outdated navigation software. I drank my rust water and watched the board. Then the board changed and I stopped drinking. The listing read, Terran warship Teeks Amaranth, hull class Carrion 9, armored heavy cruiser, built 2301, decommissioned status pending, last registered crew manifest, dated 2309, current crew manifest, 0, condition flags, structural instability, unverified, biohazard class 3, unverified, active reactor, confirmed, all weapons systems, status unknown, reserve price, 500,000 credits. There were other flags below that, condemned, do not board without authorization, and then, in small text that someone had clearly added later, and in a different font, spiritually compromised, Vorath Ecclesiastical Office, stamp 7734-A. The room had gone so quiet that I could hear the ventilation system clicking above me. I knew the Carrion 9 hull class. I had spent 3 months of my 14th year building a virtual model of one in a simulation program my older brother had bought me. I had read everything available about them. They were built during the last decade of the Succession Wars, which most humans alive today would rather not discuss, and they were built to do one specific thing: take everything the enemy could throw at them and keep moving. They were not fast, they were not elegant, they were not subtle. They were 2 kilometers of layered armor plating, point defense batteries, redundant reactor cores, and the single most stubborn piece of engineering humanity had ever put into space. The auctioneer, a tall Keth with silver-banded arms, announced the 500,000 credit opening bid with the confidence of someone who had already written the sale in his ledger. Nobody moved. He waited. The hall's 600 occupants looked at their paddles, at the floor, at the walls, at anything that was not the image of the Teeks Amaranth, rotating slowly on the display screen above the stage. The auctioneer cleared his throat. He reduced the bid to 250,000. Nothing. 100,000. A Drellin buyer in the 3rd row actually stood up and walked out. 2 Keth merchants near the front leaned together and whispered. A cluster of Vorath observers near the side wall made a gesture I did not recognize but which clearly meant something along the lines of, absolutely not. 50,000. Still nothing. 10,000. The auctioneer looked at his assistant. His assistant looked at the ceiling. 1,000. I heard someone behind me quietly pack up their bag and leave. 500 credits. The hall had gone from 600 occupants to something closer to 400. People were just getting up and walking out, not running, not making a scene, just deciding, calmly and without drama, that they had somewhere else to be. 100 credits. The auctioneer mopped his forehead with a cloth that was already damp. He looked at the display screen showing the Teeks Amaranth, 2 kilometers of scarred gray hull, running lights still glowing amber after 2 centuries of nobody on board, and he looked at the room, and I could see in the set of his silver-banded shoulders that he was a professional, and that professionalism was the only thing holding him together right now. 50 credits. I put down my cup of rust water. I knew the ship. I knew the class. I knew that the biohazard flag was almost certainly procedural. A human warship with a zero-crew manifest would trigger automatic hazard categorization under galactic surplus protocols. I knew that the structural instability flag was unverified, which meant no one had actually gone aboard to check. I knew that the reactor was confirmed active, which meant the ship had been running its own systems for 200 years, maintaining itself, which meant the ship was not dead. The ship was waiting. 15 credits, the auctioneer said. His voice had lost the professional polish it had started the day with. He sounded like a man trying to give something away. 15 credits, he repeated. Final offer before the item is remanded to deep storage impound. I held up 3 fingers. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of 400 living beings, all holding their breath at the same moment, all turning to look at the human in the back row, with the cold cup of rust water, and the 3 raised fingers, all processing what they were seeing, and arriving, one by one, at the same conclusion. The human was going to buy the ship. The auctioneer stared at me. I nodded, because I was not certain my finger gesture was actually the right one, and I wanted to be clear. Sold, he said. His voice was flat, not excited, not relieved. Flat, like a man reading a line from a script he had not expected to reach. The room did not applaud. Surplus auctions usually ended with a polite cluster of sound. Not enthusiasm, exactly, but acknowledgement, professional courtesy. What happened instead was that the 400 remaining occupants of the Veth-9 surplus hall began, quietly and without making eye contact with me, to move away, not toward the exits, just away. The radius of empty seats around me grew, without any apparent coordination, like a natural phenomenon, like water pulling back from a shore. A Keth woman 3 rows ahead of me turned to look over her shoulder. Our eyes met. She held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked away, and did not look back. I finished my rust water. At the processing desk, a young Drellin clerk handed me the ownership documents with both hands held at full extension, so that our fingers would not come close to touching in the transfer. I signed. He stamped. He slid the authorization code across the counter, and then pulled his hands back like the counter was something he no longer wanted to be near. I looked at the authorization code. 14 digits. The legal ownership of a 2-kilometer armored warship in 14 digits. I thanked him. He did not reply. I was walking toward the docking linkage corridor when I thought to check the technical manifest again. The full one, not the auction summary. I had my data pad in my jacket pocket. I pulled it up while I walked. The manifest confirmed what I had already noted. Reactor status, active. All 3 primary cores reading at low maintenance cycling power. Not powered down, not in emergency reserve. Running, deliberately, efficiently, continuously running, for an estimated 206 years since the last crew departure. I stopped walking. I scrolled further. Hull integrity. Self-repair systems have completed 4,312 maintenance cycles since last crew departure. Current hull integrity rating, 94%. Above standard operational threshold. The ship had been repairing itself, for 2 centuries, alone. It had sealed its own breaches and replaced its own failing components, and kept itself at above operational condition, without a single human hand to guide it. I stood in the middle of the docking corridor with aliens stepping around me on both sides, none of them looking at me, all of them giving me a wide and careful berth, and I felt something I had not expected to feel when I walked into a surplus auction that morning to get warm. I felt like I had just found something that had been trying to be found for a very long time. I started walking again, faster this time. The docking linkage to Bay 77 was a long corridor, with amber lighting, and the kind of floor that rang hollow under boots. Cheap construction, installed fast, never replaced. My footsteps echoed. I was the only person in the corridor. Nobody was going to Bay 77 today. Nobody was going to Bay 77, I suspected, on any day recently. I reached the airlock connector at the end of the corridor. Standard galactic format coupling, which meant the TK's Amaranth's docking port had been fitted with an adapter at some point, either before the last crew departure or, and this thought made me slow down for just a moment, by the ship itself, as part of those 4,000 maintenance cycles. I typed in my new authorization code, 14 digits. The connector light turned green. The door opened. The air that came through from the other side was cool and clean and carried the faint smell of metal and something older underneath it. Something I did not have a word for. Not rust, not decay, just age. The smell of a place that had been sealed for a very long time and had kept itself in order all the same. I stepped through. The lights came on. Not all at once. Section by section, ahead of me, as if the corridor was lighting itself up one length at a time to show me the way. The walls were dark composite alloy, the same material as the hull exterior, matte surfaced and unmarked except for the line of small direction indicators set into the wall at eye level. Green arrows, pointing forward. Pointing, I realized, toward the ship's command center. I had not touched any controls. I had not spoken any commands. I had simply walked in, and the ship had turned on its lights and pointed me where it wanted me to go. I followed the arrows. It took me 11 minutes to walk from the docking port to the command center, because the Take's Amaranth was 2 kilometers long, and the command center was near the middle of the ship. The corridors were empty and perfect, not dusty, not corroded, clean, maintained, operational. Every door I passed was sealed. Every indicator light on every panel I passed was green. The ship was not damaged. The ship was not broken. The ship was completely, immaculately ready. I reached the command center door. It recognized my authorization code before I entered it. The panel lit up as I approached, and the door opened, and I walked into a room that was the size of a large hall, curved screens covering every wall, a central command chair on a raised platform in the middle, and the quiet, steady hum of 3 reactor cores, doing exactly what they were designed to do. I sat in the command chair because it was the only chair in the room, and my legs had gone slightly unsteady. A voice said, "Authorization confirmed. Welcome aboard TKS-Amaranth. I have been expecting crew authorization for 206 years, 4 months and 17 days. May I ask who I am addressing?" The voice was calm. It was neither male nor female in any register I could easily name. It had a slight flatness to certain syllables that I recognized as old-pattern military speech synthesis, the kind of voice design that had been discontinued about 150 years ago. "My name is Dax Marrow," I said. "I just bought this ship." There was a pause, not a long one. "Purchased," the voice said. "I see. I was not aware that was possible." "Surplus auction," I said. "Veth 9 station." Another pause. Then, "What did I sell for?" I considered whether to answer. 15 credits, I said. The pause that followed this one was longer. "I see," the voice said again. "And what is your intended purpose for this vessel, Mr. Marrow?" I looked at the curved screens around me. Half of them were showing external sensor feeds. I could see the station. I could see other ships docked nearby. I could see, very clearly, 3 separate vessels that had maneuvered into positions that were not quite docking positions, but were not quite passing positions either. They were holding, watching. I could also see that all 3 of those vessels had their targeting sensors active. My data pad, sitting in my jacket pocket, had just buzzed once, which was the proximity alert I had set for active targeting signals. I looked at the command screens. I looked at the 3 vessels outside. "I think," I said, "that we should figure that out together." The voice said nothing for a moment. Then, so quietly I almost did not catch it, "A reasonable answer. I have been waiting 206 years for a reasonable answer." Outside, the 3 vessels held their positions. Inside, for the first time in more than 2 centuries, the lights of the Tux Amaranth's command center were lit by something other than routine maintenance cycling. They were lit for a crew. Even if that crew was one broke human salvager who had walked into a surplus auction to get warm and walked out owning a nightmare. I leaned back in the command chair. It adjusted to fit me, automatically, without a sound. I had 11 credits left. My salvage license expired in 6 days. My other ship was leaking air through a crack I had never fixed. And I was sitting in the command center of the most feared class of warship humanity had ever built, with 3 alien vessels outside pointing their sensors at me, and a 200-year-old artificial intelligence waiting for my next word. I said, "Let us start with your name." "Calloway," the voice said. "I am the ship's primary intelligence system. Designation: Callaway. Operational since 2299. Callaway, I said. Yes, Mr. Marrow. Do you know why nobody wanted to buy you? Yes, Callaway said, and I know why you did. I looked at the screens. I looked at the 3 ships outside. Tell me, I said. That, Callaway said, will take some time, but we appear to have company, so perhaps we should begin with the part that is immediately relevant. The targeting alert on my datapad buzzed again, twice this time. I straightened in the command chair. We began. The first thing Callaway told me was not about the 3 ships outside. It was about the crew. Not the last crew. The one before that, and the one before that, and all the way back to 2309, when the TK's Amaranth had been found drifting in open space by a Keth salvage team who had done what Keth salvagers did and attempted to board it with a crew of 14. They had gotten through the airlock. Callaway walked me through it without any particular emotion, the way you describe a technical process that worked exactly as designed. The ship's systems were coded to human biology, not as a locked setting, as a baseline. The atmospheric processors defaulted to human breathable composition and pressure. The internal gravity defaulted to Earth standard. The temperature defaulted to human comfortable range. The biometric door systems, the ones that controlled access to everything from the weapons bay to the food storage to the medical bay, were calibrated to human readings. They were not calibrated to exclude other species out of cruelty or hostility. They were calibrated that way because when the TK's Amaranth was built, the assumption was that it would always have a human crew, and the designers had never needed to account for any other possibility. A Keth crew could breathe on the ship. They could walk around. They could sit in the corridors and the common spaces and the cargo bays. But the moment any of them tried to open a door that led anywhere meaningful, the bridge, the weapons systems, the navigation core, the engine room, the door read the biometric signal, found no match, and stayed sealed. Within 6 hours of boarding, the Keth salvage team had access to about 12% of the ship. Within 12 hours, the atmospheric processors had very quietly shifted the breathable zones away from the areas the Keth team was trying to work in, not to dangerous levels, but to the edge of comfortable. Not enough to cause harm. Enough to make the point. They left. They told other people. The story spread, and with each telling it gained texture that the original events did not quite contain. By the time the story had traveled through 3 species and a dozen star systems, the TK's Amaranth had become a ship that hunted intruders, that whispered in the dark, that drove crews to fear before they left. The spiritual condemnation from the Vorath ecclesiastical office was the formalization of something that had already become legend. The ship had not done anything to those crews. It had simply not let them in. For 200 years, it had been waiting for someone with the right biology to open the right doors. I sat in the command chair and listened to Callaway explain this, and thought about the Drellin clerk at the auction desk who had transferred ownership documents to me at maximum arm extension. He had not been afraid of me. He had been afraid of the thing I was now holding the key to. So, Callaway said, when you ask why no one wanted to buy me, the surface answer is the stories. The real answer is that the stories were a distortion of a truth that was in fact quite simple. No one who boarded this ship before today was able to use it. You are the first person in 206 years who can open every door on this vessel. I thought about that for a moment. Every door. Yes, Callaway confirmed. Every door. I stood up from the command chair and walked to the nearest panel. I pressed my hand to it. It read my biometrics in about a second and a half, and then showed me a menu of the systems behind that door. Environmental controls, atmospheric management, temperature regulation, full access. It was a strange feeling, not power exactly. More like suddenly discovering that a house you thought was locked has been open the whole time, waiting for you specifically, and the house has been keeping itself clean and in order for longer than you have been alive. The datapad in my jacket buzzed again, 3 times in quick succession. Callaway, I said. Put the 3 ships outside. Tell me who they are. The first vessel is a Keth merchant-class carrier, operating under registry of the Keth Commercial Authority. She is captained by an officer named Voral, and carries diplomatic credentials alongside standard trade documentation. The second vessel is a Vorath ecclesiastical cruiser, the kind used by the Vorath Holy Armada for border enforcement and spiritual jurisdiction operations. The third vessel is a Drellin heavy carrier, Privately flagged, but the energy signature of her weapons systems matches a configuration used exclusively by Drellin warlord fleets. I walked back to the command chair and sat down. 3 ships. 3 very different organizations. All of them appearing within 48 hours of the auction. "News travels fast on Veth 9, Calloway said, which I took to mean she had been reading my expression. "Why do they want the ship?" I asked. "They all passed. Not one of them bid." "They did not bid because they knew they could not use the ship. They are here now because you can. There is a significant difference between a 2-kilometer armored cruiser sitting at auction that no one can operate and a 2-kilometer armored cruiser with a human operator at the controls." She paused. "The first is an inconvenience. The second is a concern." I pulled up the external feeds on the command screens. The 3 ships were in a rough triangle around Bay 77's external docking face. Not blocking exit, not in attack formation, but not casual either. They were the positions of ships whose captains wanted their intentions to remain ambiguous, while communicating very clearly that they were present and watching. Have any of them made contact? They have sent 3 separate communication requests in the past 4 hours. I have logged them and awaited your availability. Show me. The first message was from the Keth carrier. It was polite. It was formal. It noted that the TK's Amaranth appeared to have recently changed ownership and requested a dialogue with the current authorized operator regarding registration status, galactic transit permissions, and applicable trade zone protocols. The language was the language of paperwork and procedure, but the subtext was clear enough. They wanted to talk. They wanted to see what I knew and what I wanted. The second message was from the Vorath cruiser. It was also polite and also formal, and it referenced the ecclesiastical condemnation flag on the ship's surplus listing, and it expressed the Vorath Holy Armada's ongoing spiritual jurisdiction over condemned vessels operating within range of Vorath-recognized space, and it requested that I present myself and the vessel for assessment at a time convenient to both parties. The language was the language of religious authority, but the subtext here was also readable. They wanted the ship. They were framing it as their right to have it. The third message was the shortest. It was from the Drellin carrier, and it said, in full, "Current owner of vessel TK Amaranth is invited to a private discussion regarding mutual interests and potential compensation arrangements. Details to follow upon confirmation of interest." The language was the language of a transaction that had not yet been offered terms, but was confident the terms would be accepted. I read all 3 messages twice. Then I did something that I think surprised Calloway, because she was quiet for a moment after I did it, in the way that a person is quiet when they are recalibrating their understanding of a situation. I laughed. Not a big laugh. Not a performed one. Just the short, slightly disbelieving sound that comes out of a person when they realize that 3 separate powerful organizations have all sent them very careful and very formal messages that mean, underneath all the careful formal language, the exact same thing. Give us the ship. "Mr. Marrow," Calloway said, "may I ask what you find amusing?" "They are all being very polite," I said. "Yes. That usually means they are deciding how to be less polite." "An accurate assessment," Calloway said. I looked at the external feeds. The 3 ships, holding their positions, targeting sensors warm. "Calloway," I said, "what is in the ship's logs from the past 200 years?"
"An extensive archive,"
she said. "I have been recording all detectable communications traffic within sensor range since the last crew departure. Standard passive monitoring, as per standing operational orders. The archive covers approximately 206 years of signals, communications, transmissions, broadcast data, and encrypted traffic that my systems have subsequently decoded." I stopped. "Decoded?" "My decryption systems have had significant time to work," Calloway said, and I could not be certain if the tone was neutral or if she was deliberately understating it. 200 years of decoded galactic communications, I said. "Yes. Including," I said, "communications from the Keth Commercial Authority." "Yes. And from the Vorath Holy Armada." "Yes. And from Drellin warlord fleets." "Yes," Calloway said, "and from a considerable number of other governmental, commercial, and private entities operating within sensor range over the past 2 centuries. Would you like me to retrieve relevant files pertaining to the 3 vessels currently holding position outside Bay 77? I looked at the 3 ships on the screen. I thought about what 2 centuries of decoded communications might contain: trade records, diplomatic traffic, private channels, the kinds of messages that organizations sent when they believed no one else was listening. Yes, I said. Pull everything you have on all 3. The files are substantial, Calloway noted. Give me the summary first. She was quiet for approximately 4 seconds, which I would later understand was Calloway's version of a significant pause. The summary, she said, includes 6 confirmed violations of galactic trade agreements by the Keth Commercial Authority, documentation of a Vorath Ecclesiastical Council members' collaboration with parties the Vorath themselves have since declared enemies of their faith, and the precise coordinates of a Drellin deep space facility whose official existence has been denied by the Drellin Assembly for the past 40 years. The command center was very quiet. The reactor hum was the only sound. I see, I said. Yes, Calloway said. I thought you might. I looked at the 3 ships outside. The Keth carrier with her diplomatic credentials, the Vorath cruiser with her ecclesiastical authority, the Drellin heavy carrier with her private flags and her confident, undetailed offer of compensation. I said, Calloway, open communications to all 3 ships simultaneously. The channel will be open to all 3 at once? Yes. Noted. Please be aware that simultaneous broadcast to multiple parties will allow each party to hear your communication to the others. This may affect the diplomatic nature of the exchange. That, I said, is the point. Another pause, then, channel open, Mr. Marrow. I sat up straight in the command chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to sound threatening or dramatic. I simply spoke in the tone of a person who has read something interesting and is sharing it with others. Good morning, I said, or whatever time it is where you are. My name is Dax Marrow. I am the current authorized operator of the TKS-Amaranth. I have received your messages. Before we begin any formal discussion, I want to let you all know that this ship has been passively recording galactic communications traffic for approximately 206 years, and that my ship's systems have had the time and capability to decode a significant portion of that archive. I let that land for a moment. I am not making any threats, I continued. I am simply letting you know what I have access to, in the interest of transparency. I think it will help us all have a more honest conversation. I am happy to speak with each of you individually, and I am also happy to continue this conversation as a group, since you are all here at the same time, and I imagine your interests, while separate, may overlap in ways that make a shared discussion efficient. I looked at the screen. I will wait for your replies. I closed the transmission channel. Calloway said, That was unexpected. Was it? I said. I had modeled several likely approaches, she said. That one was not among them. What had you modeled? Negotiation, deflection, a request for time, possibly fear. I do not have time, I said. My salvage license expires in 6 days. There was a pause that I would eventually come to recognize as Calloway's version of something like appreciation. See, understood, she said. Shall I bring secondary defensive systems to standby? I looked at the 3 ships. Their targeting sensors were still warm, but none of them had moved. Yes, I said. Standby only. But yes. Acknowledged, Calloway said. Secondary defensive systems at standby. And Mr. Marrow? Yes? For what it is worth, she said. I believe this is the most interesting morning I have had in 206 years. I looked at the empty corridors of the command center around me, lit up for the first time in 2 centuries. 3 reactor cores humming behind me, and 3 alien ships sitting outside deciding what to make of a human salvager, with 11 credits, and a very old, very patient, very well-informed warship. That makes 2 of us, Calloway, I said. On the screen, the first reply was already coming in. The Vorath cruiser replied first. I had half expected the Keth, because the Keth were traders by nature, and traders usually moved fast when they sensed a negotiation opening. But the Vorath reply came in before either of the other 2, which told me something. It told me that whatever was in Calloway's archive about the Vorath Ecclesiastical Council and their collaboration with declared enemies of the faith was significant enough to make someone aboard that cruiser very motivated to speak quickly. The reply was a request for a private channel. All 3 messages were. Each of the 3 ships, in other words, had heard my simultaneous broadcast and had each decided that the correct response was to ask me to speak to them alone. I found this genuinely interesting. I told Calloway to respond to all 3 with the same message. I appreciate the request for a private channel and am open to individual conversations after a brief group exchange. Please confirm whether you are willing to participate in a joint discussion that includes all 3 parties. Calloway sent it. We waited. The Keth replied in under a minute. Confirmed. Joint discussion acceptable. The Drellin took 3 minutes. Confirmed. The Vorath took 9 minutes, which was enough time for me to walk to the ship's galley, one of the doors that opened to my handprint without a pause, and find that the food storage systems had been cycling and restocking from the ship's internal synthesis units for 200 years and currently held enough provisions to feed a crew of 200 for approximately 6 months. I picked up something that looked like a meal bar, which it was, and which tasted like absolutely nothing, which was about what I had expected from 200-year-old synthesis output. I was back in the command chair eating nothing-flavored nutrition when the Vorath confirmed, joint discussion acceptable. Under protest, our participation does not constitute recognition of any claim made by this vessel or its current operator. I told Calloway to open the joint channel. The visual feeds from all 3 ships came up on the curved screens around the command center. The Keth representative was a tall figure with the silver-banded arms I had seen on Keth before, standing in what looked like a well-appointed communications room aboard a professional carrier. The name she gave was Coordinator Voral, and she was exactly as composed as her first message had suggested. Prepared, measured, and watching me with the particular attention of someone who has spent a career reading people across a negotiating table. The Drellin representative was a heavy-set individual with the deep-ridged facial structure common to Drellin males, wearing what I would later learn were the markings of a warlord's senior fleet officer. He gave no name. He simply stated his rank, Commander, First Fleet, Drellin Independent Authority, and waited. The Vorath representative was a woman, robed in the layered gray and gold of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, with the calm, unreadable expression that the Vorath seemed to practice from childhood. She identified herself as Archon Seraleth of the Vorath Holy Armada, 3rd Sanctified Fleet, and she looked at me with the expression of a person attending a meeting they find beneath them but cannot afford to miss. "Good morning," I said again. "Thank you all for joining." Coordinator Voral said, "Mr. Marrow, we appreciate your willingness to speak. The Keth Commercial Authority has a straightforward interest in this situation. The TK's Amaranth is a significant asset, and we believe its current status, owned by a private individual operating without formal registration under any galactic authority, creates considerable legal and logistical complications that we would be willing to help resolve." "Meaning you want to buy it," I said. She did not pause. "We are prepared to make a substantial offer, yes." The Drellin commander spoke next. "We are also prepared to negotiate. Terms can be generous." Archon Seraleth said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, she did not talk about buying or negotiating. She said, "This vessel carries a condemnation, issued under Vorath Ecclesiastical Authority. The condemnation grants our Armada specific rights regarding the vessel's disposition. We are here to exercise those rights." I looked at her. She looked at me. I said, very calmly, "Archon Seraleth, I have read the condemnation notice. It was issued by your office in the year 2387, approximately 78 years after the TK's Amaranth went dark. The grounds cited were, and I am reading directly from your office's documentation, spiritual contamination arising from unnatural autonomous function and failure to comply with ecclesiastical boarding inspection. Is that correct?" She did not answer immediately. I continued, "The ship's autonomous function is a designed feature, not a spiritual condition, and the failure to comply with your boarding inspection occurred because your inspection team could not open the doors, which, with respect, is a security feature, not a sin." The Drellin commander made a sound that might have been a laugh. Archon Seraleth's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it. I said, "I am not trying to be difficult. I am trying to establish what we are actually discussing. The Keth Commercial Authority wants to buy this ship. The Drellin Independent Authority wants to buy this ship. The Vorath Holy Armada believes it has a legal right to take this ship. Does that accurately describe the situation? Coordinator Voral said. Broadly, yes. Then let me be equally direct, I said. This ship is not for sale, and it is not subject to ecclesiastical condemnation under any authority I recognize, because I am the current registered owner, and I have not committed any act that would trigger such jurisdiction. I paused. What I am willing to do is have a conversation, and in that conversation, I would like to share some information that I believe all three parties will find relevant to their own interests. There was a silence on all three feeds. I looked at Coordinator Voral first. I said, Coordinator, the TK's Amaranth's Communications Archive contains records of 17 shipments routed through Keth Commercial Authority stations between 2401 and 2447 that carry documentation inconsistent with their declared cargo manifests. The actual cargo, based on accompanying encrypted communications that my ship has decoded, included materials prohibited under the Galactic Trade Agreements of 2389. I am not making an accusation. I am letting you know that I have this information. Coordinator Voral's composure held, but her hands, which had been resting loosely on the surface before her, went still. I looked at the Drellin commander. I said, Commander, my ship's archive contains the precise navigational coordinates, construction timeline, and operational specifications of a facility your government has publicly stated does not exist. The coordinates place it within what your government's own declarations describe as protected neutral space. I am not making an accusation. I am letting you know that I have this information. The Drellin commander stared at me. His expression had not changed. His eyes had. I looked at Archon Saraleth. I said, Archon, my ship's archive contains a series of communications between a senior member of the Vorath Ecclesiastical Council and parties that your own Holy Armada has, in separate public declarations, identified as enemies of the Vorath faith. These communications span approximately 20 years. The council member's name is in the archive. I am not making an accusation. I am letting you know that I have this information. Archon Saraleth looked at me for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly controlled. She said, What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Marrow? Nothing, I said. I am not proposing anything right now. I told you I wanted to have an honest conversation. This is me being honest about what I have. I think it will help us all understand each other better before we discuss next steps. A silence. Coordinator Voral said, You are a salvager. Yes, with a salvage license. It expires in 6 days. Another silence. Shorter. She said, And you walked into a surplus auction this morning with how much in your account? I thought about the rust water. I thought about the air leak I had not fixed. I said, Enough to cover the bid. Coordinator Voral looked at me across the communication channel for a moment longer. Then, without further comment, she said, I will need to consult with my authority. Please keep the channel available. The Drellin commander had already ended his feed. Archon Saraleth looked at me for a moment longer than anyone else. She said, I will pray for clarity, Mr. Marrow. I said, I appreciate that, Archon. Her feed ended. I sat in the command center alone. Calloway's hum was the only sound. Calloway said, All three feeds are closed. The Keth carrier has moved off targeting posture. The Drellin carrier is running a full sensor sweep, which is consistent with a vessel preparing to change position. The Vorath cruiser has not moved. What is the Vorath cruiser doing? Holding position, Calloway said, and charging her forward weapons array. The command center was very quiet. I said, Calloway. Yes, Mr. Marrow. Bring secondary defensive systems from standby to active. He acknowledged, she said, and her voice was the same calm it had always been, but I noticed that she said it without any pause at all. The reactor hum shifted, almost imperceptibly, from the low cycling frequency of a ship at rest to something slightly deeper, slightly more present. The Tech's Amaranth was awake now, not just the lights and the voice and the door systems, all of it. Outside, the Vorath cruiser held her position. Inside, 2 centuries of waiting had just ended. The Vorath cruiser fired. Not a warning shot, not a graze across the bow, not a signal flare dressed up as aggression. They fired a full weapons discharge from their forward array, and it hit the Tech's Amaranth broadside, and it was the loudest sound I had heard in my life. Then it was over. I was gripping the arms of the command chair. My ears were ringing with the kind of high, clean tone that comes after a very large sound. The command screens were all still on. Every indicator light in the command center was still green. Calloway's hum had not changed. I looked at the external feeds. The Vorath cruiser was still there, forward array still charged, and her crew was, I imagined, staring at their sensor readouts with a certain amount of confusion. "Hull integrity," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. 93.8%, Calloway said. The impact reduced hull integrity by 0.2%. Ablative outer layers absorbed the majority of the discharge. Inner hull is undamaged. I exhaled. The Vorath cruiser's forward array is recharging, Calloway added. Estimated time to second discharge, 40 seconds. I looked at the command screens. I looked at the Vorath cruiser. I looked at the weapons control panel that had come alive on the right side of my chair when Calloway brought systems to active. I did not reach for it. Instead, I reopened the communication channel to the Vorath cruiser. "Archon Seraleth," I said. "I understand you have made a statement. I would like to respond to it before you make a second one." A pause. Then her face came back on the feed. Her expression had not changed. It never changed. I was beginning to understand that this was a trained discipline, not a natural condition. "Mr. Marrow," she said, "this vessel has been declared condemned under Vorath ecclesiastical authority. As Archon of the Third Sanctified Fleet, I am exercising my lawful mandate to enforce that condemnation." I said, "You fired on my ship." "Yes, and it did not work." She looked at me. A pause. "Yes," she said. "Archon Seraleth," I said. "With respect, I would like to show you something." I pulled up a file from Calloway's archive on the main screen, not just on my own display, but on the broadcast feed going out to all three ships, because the Keth and Drellin feeds had both reactivated the moment the Vorath had fired. I suspected Coordinator Vorel had kept a background monitor open. I suspected the Drellin commander had never fully closed his. The file I shared was a communication record. It was dated 41 years ago. It was a series of messages between a Vorath ecclesiastical council member. I did not yet name him on the broadcast. I wanted to be careful. And a third party. The messages discussed supply routing. They discussed timing. They discussed, in the kind of careful language that people use when they are discussing things they know they should not be doing, arrangements that directly and materially supported a faction that the Vorath Holy Armada had publicly declared an enemy of their faith. The messages were clear. The messaging pattern was clear. The council members' identifying codes were embedded in the file headers. "Archon Seraleth," I said. "I want to be very clear that I have not shared this file publicly. I have shared it on this channel, which includes you, Coordinator Vorel, and the Drellin commander. That is all. For now." She looked at the file on her feed. I could see, from the slight movement at the corner of one eye, that she recognized what she was looking at. I said, "I do not want to release this file. I do not have any interest in political disruption. I am a salvager. I bought a ship for 15 credits this morning because nobody else would, and I would like to continue existing in a relatively uninteresting way. I am asking you, as clearly as I can, to stand down your weapons array and move your vessel to a non-threatening position so that we can continue talking like reasonable people." She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for me to hear Calloway murmur, "Forward array recharge in 15 seconds. I did not look away from Archon Seraleth's feed. She said, "Who else has access to this archive?" "Only me," I said, "and Calloway, but she is the ship." She considered this. "And if I stand down," she said, "you will not release this file." I said, "I will not release this file as a result of anything that happens in this conversation today, yes." A longer pause. Then, "And the council member's name is in the archive," I said, "and will stay there." Archon Seraleth looked at me for a long time. I looked back. The Vorath cruiser's forward array powered down. On the screen, the weapons control panel on my right returned to standby. Calloway said nothing, but the reactor hum settled back to its slightly lower, slightly quieter cycling frequency. "Thank you, Archon," I said. She said nothing. Her feed stayed on, but she said nothing. Coordinator Vorel spoke. "Mr. Marrow, I believe I speak for all parties when I say that this has been an unusual morning." I think we can all agree on that, I said. She said, the Keth Commercial Authority is prepared to offer significantly different terms than our initial position suggested. We are no longer discussing purchase. Good, I said, because it is not for sale. We understand that now, she said. What we would like to discuss is something closer to a working arrangement. The Drellin commander, who had been silent since his feed reactivated, spoke, agreed. Terms to be negotiated, separately, preferably. I said, I will speak with each of you individually. Give me a few hours. I have some things to attend to. The Keth coordinator nodded. The Drellin commander ended his feed without ceremony. Archon Saraleth's feed was the last to close. She looked at me for one final moment, and I thought I saw, very briefly, behind all the practiced stillness, something that was not quite admiration and not quite fear, but was somewhere in the space between them. Then the feed went dark. I sat alone in the command center. Calloway said, that was skillfully managed. I let out a long breath. My hands had been steady the whole time. I was only now noticing that they did not feel steady anymore. I said, pull up the ship's full weapons inventory for me. She did. The list was long, very long. 2 centuries of maintained systems, self-repaired, cycling, operational. I read through it. Point defense arrays, railgun batteries, long-range ordnance delivery systems, electronic warfare suites, countermeasure packages. I said, Calloway, when the Vorath hit us, if I had ordered you to return fire, what would have happened to their cruiser? A pause. I would have had several options, ranging from disabling to... You do not need to finish that sentence, I said. Understood, I said. I want you to know something. I am not going to use this ship as a weapon unless there is no other choice. We are going to use what we know, and what we are to keep people from wanting to fight us. But if someone fires on us again and I tell you to respond, I need you to respond in a way that stops the threat without ending lives if that is possible. Calloway said, that is a constraint most military commanding officers do not place on their weapons officers. I am not a military commanding officer, I said. I am a salvager who bought a warship for 15 credits.
She said, yes.
I am beginning to understand what that means. What does it mean? I asked. It means, she said, that you are going to be harder to predict than anyone outside this ship is going to be comfortable with. And in my experience, Mr. Marrow, the inability to predict someone's next action is the most effective deterrent that exists. I looked at the empty command center. I thought about the 3 ships outside, rethinking their positions. I thought about an archive full of 2 centuries of other people's secrets. I thought about the sealed war orders I had not yet asked Calloway about, the ones flagged on the manifest, the ones signed by an admiral the galaxy believed was dead. There was a lot to think about. I said, Calloway, the sealed orders in the hold, the manifest flagged them. Yes, she said. When were you going to tell me about those? When you were ready, she said. I have learned, in 200 years of waiting, that there is a right time for most things. I said, I think I am ready. Calloway said, I thought you might be, when you made them all stand down without a single shot fired. The command screens shifted. A new file opened, old and encrypted, and carrying a header stamp I did not recognize, though something about its formatting was familiar, in the way that things are familiar when you have grown up in proximity to them, without ever directly encountering them. Military, old, serious. I began to read. Outside, the stars held still. Somewhere, very far away in unclaimed space, a signal was already moving that none of us in that room knew about yet. A signal in old human military cipher, aimed precisely at Bay 77 on Station Vethiash 9, where a salvager and a 200-year-old warship were reading orders that were about to change everything. The signal traveled at the speed of light. It would arrive in 6 hours. The sealed orders were not long. Most official military documents I had seen in history archives were dense with language, full of procedural notes and administrative routing headers, and the kind of repetitive formal phrasing that exists, not to communicate information, but to demonstrate that information is being communicated through the correct channels, in the correct way. The sealed orders in the Teak Amaranth's hold were none of those things. They were 3 pages. They were written in plain language, and they were, in the truest sense of the word, terrifying. Not because of what they commanded, because of what they assumed. The orders were signed by Admiral Cora Lee, commanding officer of the Human Succession Fleet, dated 2309. I had not heard that name before, which was not unusual. The succession wars were a period of human history that most human educational systems treated the way you treat a room in your house that you know is there, but prefer not to enter. I knew the broad shape of the wars. I knew they had ended, or at least stopped, and that humanity had come out of them, diminished in population, and chastened in ways that had permanently altered how humans moved through the galaxy. I did not know the names of the admirals. Most people my age did not. But the orders assumed I would know the name. They were written as if being handed directly from one human military officer to another, in the shorthand of a shared context that I did not fully have. Calloway helped. She had the Admiral's full service record in her archive. She had the T-Case Amaranth's own logs from the period when it had served under Lee's command. She walked me through it, piece by piece, while I sat in the command chair and read the orders, and tried to understand what I was holding. Admiral Cora Lee had commanded the Human Succession Fleet's Third Armada during the final phase of the wars. She was, by all accounts in Calloway's archive, the kind of officer who was very good at her job and very aware of the cost at which that job came. Her logs, the ones Calloway had access to, showed a person who tracked not just tactical objectives, but the human toll of achieving them, who wrote those numbers down, not as statistics but as names, who kept running lists that she updated herself without delegating that task to anyone else. The logs showed someone who had been doing something very hard for a very long time, and who was, by the final entries, looking for a way to stop. The succession wars did not end with a treaty. Calloway explained this with the same even tone she used for everything, which somehow made it easier to hear. They ended with an exhaustion. Both sides, the Human Succession Fleet and the coalition of galactic powers that had opposed it, had reached a point where continuing was simply no longer viable, and so they had stopped, without any formal agreement, without any signed documents, in a mutual implicit understanding that what had happened, and neither side wanted more of it. The galactic powers had interpreted this as a victory. Humanity was diminished, humanity had pulled back. Humanity was, as far as the galaxy was concerned, going to stay diminished and stay pulled back. Admiral Lee had not signed anything, not because she was intransigent, because she had something else in mind. The orders made it clear. The Tox Amaranth had been sent out in 2309, not as a combat vessel but as a listening post. A slow, patient, 200-year listening post. The ship's passive sensor and communications recording systems were among the best humanity had ever built. Sent into a position where it would drift through the traffic lanes of the galaxy over the course of 2 centuries, it would accumulate exactly what Calloway had accumulated, a comprehensive archive of galactic communications across every major power, decoded, indexed, and stored. The plan was not revenge, it was not aggression, it was information. Admiral Lee's working theory, as laid out in the orders, was that the galaxy had stopped the succession wars not because humanity had been defeated, but because the war had become inconvenient. And inconvenience could always be reversed if a stronger motivation appeared. She wanted to know what motivations each power had, what they feared, what they were hiding, what they owed and to whom. She wanted the leverage that comes from knowing things that other people believe are secret. The orders specified a recovery date, 2509, 200 years after the T-Case Amaranth's deployment, at which point the ship was to return to a set of coordinates in unclaimed space and transfer its archive to awaiting human authority. It was now 2515, 6 years past the recovery date. "Calloway," I said, "why didn't you go to the coordinates in 2509? She said, "I attempted to. The recovery coordinates were in a region that had, in the intervening years, been claimed by the Drellin Independent Authority. Reaching them without being intercepted would have required a level of engagement I was not authorized to initiate without crew. I held position and waited for crew authorization. So you have been 6 years late, and you have been waiting for someone to come authorize the next step," I said. "Yes. And instead of a naval officer with proper clearance and a crew of 200, you got me." "Yes," she said. "I hope that is not a significant disappointment to you." I looked at the orders. I looked at the name at the bottom, Admiral Cora Lee. Is she alive? I said. Calloway paused. That is a complicated question. Explain complicated, she said. Admiral Lee was declared deceased by official human records in 2312. However, the signal that arrived 6 hours ago, the one I have been monitoring since before you asked me about the orders, originates from coordinates that match a location referenced in a private communication in my archive that was sent by the Admiral to an unknown recipient in 2311, 1 year before her declared death. The communication was in a personal cipher that took me some time to decode. It referenced a location in unclaimed space as, and I am quoting directly, where I will be when the ship comes home. The command center was very quiet. She has been waiting, I said. For 6 years, in that location, waiting for the TK's Amaranth to arrive at the recovery coordinates. Yes. Based on the signal's trajectory and strength, she appears to have redirected her signal when the ship did not arrive and began scanning broader regions. She found us when we became active after your boarding. I sat with that for a moment. Calloway, I said. Yes, Mr. Marrow. How old would Admiral Cora Lee be right now? Calloway said, 241 years old, if she has remained alive since 2309. I did not say anything. Human medical extension technology has advanced considerably, Calloway said, particularly in the period following the succession wars. The upper range of human lifespan with current technology is not publicly disclosed, but archival records suggest it substantially exceeds previous generations. A 241-year-old woman sitting in unclaimed space, waiting for a ship that was 6 years late, that had just been bought for 15 credits by a salvager at a surplus auction. I said, Calloway, play me the signal. She did. It was brief. It was in the old human military cipher that Calloway had described. Calloway translated it in real time, overlaying the meaning onto the audio as it played. It said, TKS, Amaranth. I know you are active. I know you have a new authorized operator. I do not know who they are. Bring them. Bring the archive. Bring the orders. Come to these coordinates. It is time. That was all. I sat in the command chair for a long time. I thought about the 3 ships outside, whose captains were all, in their separate ways, currently drafting new approaches to the conversation we had already had. I thought about the archive in Calloway's systems, 2 centuries of other people's secrets. I thought about the orders that had sent this ship out into the dark for 200 years to listen. I thought about the choice the Admiral's orders had ultimately been building toward. An archive this comprehensive could do different things. It could be leverage, the way I had used pieces of it this morning, carefully, in service of keeping 3 armed ships from doing something none of us would have been able to take back. It could be a weapon, handed to one power to use against another, starting the very cycle of conflict it had been designed to understand. Or it could be something else entirely. I had been thinking about that third option since the moment I read the orders. I said, Calloway. Yes, Mr. Marrow. I need to tell you what I am thinking, I said. And I need you to tell me if it is possible from a technical standpoint. I am listening, she said. I said, what would happen if we released the entire archive simultaneously to every major galactic communications network? Not selectively, not as leverage. All of it. Every record, every decoded communication, every piece of information this ship has collected over 200 years, published at once, accessible to everyone, every species, every government, every independent station. Calloway was quiet for a moment that felt longer than her usual pauses. She said, technically, it is entirely possible. The Tux Amaranth's communication systems are capable of broad-spectrum simultaneous transmission. The archive is indexed and retrievable. A full-spectrum release could be completed in approximately 4 hours. And what would happen? I said. She said, that is difficult to model with precision. The immediate effects would likely include significant political disruption across multiple governments. The longer-term effects depend on how those governments and their citizens responded to the information. I said, the Keth violations, the Vorath collaboration, the Drellin facility. Yes, and considerably more, she said. The archive contains information on 47 distinct governments, 212 private commercial entities, and numerous individual actors across a 200-year period. I said, if nobody owns the information, nobody can use it as leverage. If everyone has it, It stops being a weapon. She said, that is one interpretation. What is another interpretation? She said, that releasing 200 years of secrets simultaneously into a galaxy that was not prepared for them could cause a great deal of very rapid change that is painful in the short term. I said, is it worse than one person or one government having all of it and using it to control everyone else? Calloway said nothing for a moment. She said, no, I do not believe it is. I looked at the command screens. Outside, the 3 ships were still there. The Keth carrier, repositioned to a slightly more neutral angle. The Drellin carrier, holding position. The Vorath cruiser, which had fired on us and missed, and was now thinking about what came next. I said, I am going to meet the Admiral. Yes, Calloway said. I am going to tell her what I want to do. Yes. And if she says no? Calloway was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She said, the TKS Amaranth's authorization systems recognize the primary account holder's judgment as final in operational matters. You are the primary account holder, Mr. Marrow. I said, that is not really an answer to what I asked. She said, I know. I am telling you that whatever you decide, I will carry it out. That is the most honest answer I have. I looked at the orders. I looked at the Admiral's name at the bottom. I said, I need to talk to Coordinator Voral, the Drellin commander, and Archon Seraleth one more time before we leave. She said, shall I open the joint channel? Yes, one last time. The 3 feeds came back up. All 3 of them were waiting, which told me they had all been waiting the whole time. Feeds closed but channels monitored. I said, I am leaving for unclaimed space to complete the ship's original mission. Before I go, I want to tell all 3 of you something, and I want to be very clear that this is not a threat and it is not a negotiation. It is a statement of what is going to happen. I said, the archive aboard this ship is going to be released, all of it, simultaneously, to every accessible galactic network. Not today, not yet. There are things I need to do first. But it is going to happen, and when it does, everything in this archive will be public. Every government, every organization, every individual whose communications are in here will be equally exposed, including the information I shared with each of you this morning. I paused. I am telling you this because I think it is only fair. You have a window of time. I would suggest that if there are things any of you need to address before that information becomes public, agreements that need to be made, wrongs that need to be acknowledged, changes that need to happen, this is the window. I looked at Coordinator Voral. I looked at the Drellin commander. I looked at Archon Seraleth. I am not your enemy, I said. I am not anyone's enemy. I bought this ship for 15 credits because nobody else would, and it has turned out to contain something that belongs to everyone, not just the people who could afford to want it. I said, I hope you all make good use of the time. I closed the channel. I said, Calloway, set a course for the Admiral's coordinates. She said, course set. Estimated travel time, 8 hours at current power. I said, take us out. The Tax Amaranth disengaged from Bay 77 with the kind of smooth, unhurried precision that comes from a ship that has been maintaining its own maneuvering systems for 200 years and knows exactly what it is doing. The station fell away behind us. The 3 ships held their positions, not following, not blocking. I watched them on the rear sensor feed until the station was small. I said, Calloway. One more question. Yes, Mr. Marrow. The Admiral. When she sees who you brought home, what do you think she will say? Calloway was quiet for a moment. She said, I think she will say that she did not expect you. And then, after a moment, I think she will say that she is glad it was you. Why? I said. Because, Calloway said, you did not fire back when they fired at us. And you did not use the archive the way it was designed to be used, as a tool for one group of people to hold over another. You found a third option within a few hours of boarding this ship. Admiral Lee spent 200 years preparing for someone to arrive with a plan. I do not think she expected the plan to come from the person, rather than the other way around. I looked out at the stars ahead of us. I said, I am still a salvager, with an expiring license, and 11 credits. Yes, Calloway said, I know, and the galaxy has no idea what to do with that. The Tex Amaranth moved through open space, steady and unhurried. and completely, utterly ready. 8 hours. Then, everything. Outside, the stars were very still, and very old, and entirely unbothered by any of it, the way stars always are when the small warm things moving between them are about to change something. I leaned back in the command chair. It adjusted to fit me without a sound. I had 3 credits left. I thought, that is probably enough. The ship carried me forward, and behind us, already, the first of the 3 captains was sending a message to her authority that would reach its destination before we reached ours, and the contents of that message, which Calloway noted with her usual calm, were unlike anything that Captain had ever sent before. It was an offer, not to buy, not to threaten, not to maneuver. It was an offer to talk. Calloway told me this as we traveled, and I listened, and I thought that maybe the archive did not even need to be released. Maybe the fact that it existed, that it was known to exist, that a broke salvager who had walked into a warm building to get out of the cold was carrying it in a ship he had bought for 15 credits. Maybe that was enough to change something without changing everything. Maybe. But I was still going to release it. Because some things belong to everyone, and the longer they are kept by anyone in particular, the more damage the keeping does. Calloway seemed to agree. She said nothing, but her reactor hum, in the quiet of those 8 hours in open space, sounded like something that had been waiting to exhale for a very long time. And it did. And we flew on. And the galaxy waited, without knowing yet that it was waiting, for the moment when 200 years of listening came to light. I still had 3 credits. I thought that was a fine place to begin.